So one of the biggest items of news for this photography community in the last decade has been the emergence of the Tate taking a much more serious interest in photography. And it was fantastic yesterday to see Nick Sirota, he sat in the room, he the director of the Tate, he toured all the hobby shows. Simon Baker, the newly appointed photography curator, was here. And we're delighted this morning to hear from Frances Morris, who is the head of international collections at the Tate, who's going to talk to us about her response to photography and prints. Thank you, Frances.
I get a bit of a fraud addressing you, because I know nothing about photography. But I'm passionate about photography as well, I know very little. And right from my very earliest years at the Tate, I was very keen that photography should become part of the bigger picture. And I just wanted to start by showing you this fantastic image, anonymous image from the late 19th century, which was recently donated to Tate by Michael Hoppen in celebration of the fact that we finally appointed a curator of photography to set up not a department of photography, but a strategy for including it centre stage amongst our activities. And then my second image is this wonderful work by Keith Arnott, which was acquired by Tate in 1973 and was one of the very first works in photography that the museum acquired at a time when, in the wake of conceptual artists' appropriation and use of photography as a medium alongside performance, sculpture and other media. Now Keith, some years later, in 1982, published an acerbic commentary on Tate's policy in creative camera, drawing attention to what I think now we see as a kind of form of institutional neglect. Insofar as under previous directorship, Tate made a kind of odd, inappropriate, now really slightly, certainly a moribund distinction between artists who use the camera and photographers who use the camera. And I think what, certainly during the early 1970s and early 1980s, the kind of photographs that Tate acquired were, as I've said, photographs that tended to document performances or that were involved as an aspect of conceptual art practice. During the late 1980s and 1990s, and really in the wake of mainstream fine art galleries taking on photographers making large-scale prints, we then began to acquire large-scale prints that had the status and this display potential really of painting. So a number of British artists entered the collection at this time, Hannah Collins amongst them, and then a number of internationally renowned artists, including Jeff Wall, who I think was here yesterday. It really took another few years, and it was in the build-up to the establishment of Tate Modern that a group of us at the Tate were in fact invited to rethink a number of our collecting principles and our display principles. And as part of that process, there were two really strong conclusions. One was that it was no longer possible or desirable to have a collection that was limited geographically to a collection of North American and Western European art. And the other was that it was no longer possible or tenable to have a collection that was limited in terms of media, and that both geography and media should become part of the mainstream. But institutions take time to change, and it was another several years before we had a strategy in place, and the trustees had endorsed the move to expand the medium base of the collection to include photography and indeed film. And it was only last year, 2009, that we finally appointed a photography curator. And I think it's symptomatic of both the seriousness of the intention, but also the fact that we acknowledged that the curatorial team at Tate was lacking in its expertise, that we appointed somebody who didn't have a curatorial background, but in fact had a background within the teaching of photography, and he was extremely knowledgeable both about the history of the medium and its technical basis. So how have we thought about collecting photography since then? Of course, we're not the only institution collecting photography in the UK. we're only the most recent of the national museums to take up the challenge, and therefore we fit into an environment already modulated by the work of the Victoria and Albert Museum, the British Museum and the National Media Museum in Bradford. And right from the start of our thinking, the plan has been very much involved in discussion and collaboration with those institutions, who already have well-established collections and particular directions and imperatives. So in a way what we've done is sort of to fit around them and not tread on their toes, but we are the only institution in the UK that can collect photography in relation to the history of art, and that does give us a kind of unique position. DNA Bradford and the British Museum all have different remits. It's also impossible at this moment in time to catch up. I think we felt very strongly that we could never take on the history of photography, and that it should not be our remit to collect a kind of narrative of photography from its inception to now. So we have tried and are trying to do something different. We are trying to, I suppose, complement our collection, and we're focusing on those moments in the history of art where photography is really a mainstream part of the debate and the dialogue and conversation, and in particular areas where the collection at the Tate is already strong. So, for example, surrealism is an area where we're really keen to expand our holdings of photography, as indeed is the whole area of post-1970s conceptual art. But there are also the themes that cross the genres, cross the media, landscape, still life, portraiture, and of course more recently the whole area of documentary practice and expanded notions of documentary practice. So we continue to expand our holdings of conceptual practice, and this is a recent acquisition by John Baldessari, aligning boards of 1972. And it's interesting in relation to this conversation today, these were prints that Baldessari made in 1972. They're small C prints, and they're very, very, in a way, poor quality, random, casual snapshots of a ball thrown up in the air on the sidewalk in Los Angeles where he lives. And the whole point of the, I suppose, the exercise is the randomness of the depiction. But the way the works are hung is not at a particular height, but the works are hung in relation to the height of the ball, so they're aligned along where the ball marks each photograph. But so shown in John Baldessari's recent retrospective, which is opening in the Met just now, the degradation of the print is evident, and it's almost daily they're fading. So the decision was taken after the Tate Modern showing of the work that they would not be, these prints would not be shown again. So they now exist in the dark as sort of archival, sort of the original moment, and an exhibition copies are being shown as part of the exhibition. And I think that's something we might discuss later, but it's certainly one way that a museum can both honour the original, the vintage print, but allow the image or the conceptual nature of the work to be shown in perpetuity. I talked about surrealism, and the first move we made in beginning to embrace photography in relation to surrealism was with a group of Claude Cahun vintage photographs acquired 3 years ago. Another area of the collection with strength is, of course, with interwar and mid-century abstraction. We have very strong holdings of European and British constructive art of this period. And we're trying to now use this area as one way of expanding, not just into photography, but also into collecting in new parts of the world, where you see constructive abstraction occurring in radical avant-garde movements in Brazil, Latin America, and indeed the Far East. So this is a small group of vintage prints by Geraldo de Barros, avant-garde Brazilian photographer, and somebody who was very influenced by Macaulay Hodge and Man Ray, who was also very closely aligned with a group of avant-garde painters in Sao Paulo during the early 1950s. And even more recently, a group of Japanese modernist photographs, again vintage material, part of a huge collection which was recently what we called disseminated onto the market, and sadly split up, but including work by Iwayo Yamagaki, who was was a Japanese photographer shown on the left here, who actually was at the Dessau Bauhaus in the very early 1930s, and then whose work back in Japan was disseminated through all sorts of magazines and exhibition formats, and had a very big impact on his contemporaries of the time, and that both in independent photography, but also seeping into the world of advertising photography in Japan in the 1930s too. So you can begin to see that through photography we're making interesting connections across different regional centres too.